Tomorrow, and then more this weekend. It's going to be great. I got to get out of it. Don't bother me. Yeah, tomorrow you do. It's a little more north of us. My notes loaded here. All right, we are in Esther. Almost said Ezekiel because I looked down in my Bible, it said Ezekiel. But we're not in Ezekiel. We could. I like the book of Ezekiel. We're going to be in chapter 9 of Esther. And if you notice on your notes, I have Esther 9 and 10 together. And the reason is chapter 10, if you haven't read it, which I'm sure you have, is very short. And so there's really not a reason to dedicate a whole outline just to that chapter. Now, if you're reading the Apocrypha, they add 10 or 11 more verses, but that's not biblical. So that's not a part of the text. That is added by the Hebrew transcribers from back when the Septuagint was made. So that is not what we're going to be looking at. But we're looking at chapter 9. And so from the events of chapter 8, which what happened in chapter 8? I know it's been a couple weeks. What happened in chapter 8? Yes, somebody got hung. That's right. And that was actually chapter 7. But chapter 8 was right after that, the same day. Yeah, a new decree was sent out, right? So the first decree was that anybody in the kingdom could, on that certain day, go out and kill every Jew, male, female, child, whatever, and take their plunder. And so the fix for that, since it cannot be changed, was that Esther and Mordecai sent out a new decree that said that the Jews could defend themselves against man, woman, or child who attack them and take their plunder. Now, as we're going to see in chapter 9, that didn't happen. The plunder didn't happen. Not one record of that is recorded. Matter of fact, it's the opposite. It is stated 3 different times that they did not take their plunder, which is interesting. We'll talk about that as we get there. But if you remember from chapter 6 through chapter 8, it was roughly about 3 months. So the events of chapter 7 and 8 was about 3 months after the decree was sent out, the first decree. Now, from chapter 8 to chapter 9 is about 9 months. So it's been about 9 months, and now we have reached that day, on the day, the 14th day of Adar, when this was going to all come down. And so, somebody want to read, let's see, I don't want to read the whole chapter at once. Let's read 1 through 6, please.
Overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could withstand them because fear of them fell upon all people. And all the officials of the province, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. Thus the Jews defeated all the enemies with a stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. And in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men.
All right, so verse 1, the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, and I said the 14th day, it was the 13th day. The time came for the decree to be executed. Now, before we even, which we've read this, but before we even get into it, what does common sense tell you? If you have a decree that says you can go and kill any Jew you want, then a new decree that comes out and says that those Jews can then protect themselves, and both have come from the king, what would be common sense to a person in the Persian Empire to not do? Go after the Jews. Why?
Because they could get killed themselves.
Yeah. Now, we talked about it could be confusing for them to have one law that says this and another law to say this. But remember, the law of the Medes and the Persian can never be changed. So that's why it could not be redacted. And the king could not, even the king himself could not do that, or he'd be breaking law. So it's, to me, if I was living in that time, I would say, you know what, I'm not going to do this. I'm just going to stay home that day. But that didn't happen at all. And so this decree, the day came, and on the day the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, and the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. And so there had to be an extreme hate towards the Jews in the kingdom. The Bible tells us it's hate, but what can lead to hate? There's several things. It's kind of vague.
I had someone tell me a while back, and I thought about it. He says that, hate stems from jealousy.
Yep. So, exactly. And as we're going to see, that something that's probably going to make them jealous, and something that we see as we talk about Mordecai more, the people, the Jews, were very prosperous. I mean, that's what we talked about in the beginning. This was a big impact upon their economy to have the Jews wiped out. Because even Esther said this was going to be a big thing for the king if this happened. So, as Caleb said, jealousy. Can greed lead to hate? The people here have this idea that, if they kill the Jews, they can plunder them, therefore they're going to increase their money, things like that. So that hate came from there. But it definitely tells us that the scriptures many times say that they had a great hatred for the Jews, and so they wanted to kill them. You look at verse 2, as we looked at, the Jews then gathered in their cities and throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought them harm, and no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell on all the people. No one could stand against them. What is, we talked about in Revelation, this is very physical here we're looking at. What we talk about in the book of Revelation, in chapter, I remember what chapter, chapter 8, I think it's chapter 8. When it talks about those enemies of God on the day of judgment, or when a nation falls, who is able to stand against God? Yeah, no one is able to. The only ones that will still be left standing is God's people. Notice, as we talked about, there's no mention of God in this book. But who is able to stand in the day of vengeance upon God's people? The Jews. God's people were. That's a similar theme throughout the Bible. Now, this is a very physical example here. The book of Revelation is not a physical. They still lost their lives. We talk about those who were under the altar, who had been sacrificed, who had been killed. They were not able to stand physically, but their souls were not harmed because they were God's people. And so here in the Old Testament, we're seeing, yes, God's not mentioned, but in this day of wickedness, in this day that Jews could have lost their lives, they stood and were not defeated, because who was behind it? God was. So it doesn't have to say God was behind this. It doesn't have to say that God did this, because we know God's people are protected. God's providence is seen here. But
Who were these people that were enemies against the Jews? Was it just one certain group of people, or several?
so the decree went out for all the provinces. Now remember, all the provinces was 100 and how many?
127.
Yeah, 127. And it stretched from India all the way to, he tried to take Macedonia and Thrace, but he couldn't. So many different people? Many. So it would be anybody in those provinces. So they're all under the Medo-Persian Empire, so they're Persian in a sense because they're under their control. So it would be the Persian people. But it included people from all the way from India all the way to Asia, Asia Minor. So it would have been just anybody that's not a Jew, basically. And so they tried to take vengeance or tried to kill the Jews, and it didn't happen. But I think it's interesting in verse 2. It says, no one could withstand them because fear of them fell upon all the people. Why was there fear? I think you're right. Somebody read Joshua 5 and verse 1. We see something similar to this happen in other places. And this is one example. Joshua 5 and verse 1.
So it was when all the kings of the Amorites were on the west side of the Jordan, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan from before the children of Israel, until we had crossed over, that their heart melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the children of Israel.
Okay, so you have an example there. You have, this is the setting. Israel, the children of Israel, not at that time, the Hebrew people, were going to go into the promised land and take it and conquer it. Joshua was leading them. And they have went across the Jordan, which was a pretty big river. It still is. And the people of the land heard how they had went across on dry land. What does that mean to them? What does it mean when they say that they came across on dry land? There was a bigger force behind them. And it says their hearts melted. Matter of fact, if you read later, when they go to the city of Jericho, the spies go in, they meet someone, Rahab, and does Rahab say something very similar? Yeah. Rahab says, I have heard of how you have wandered in the wilderness and how all the great things that God has done for you. She was scared. Her heart had melted. So you can see God was behind it. That was part of God's way of taking the promised land, was he prepared them before the Jews even got there. And when they came in, they conquered them because God was behind it. Same thing's going on here. God was behind this. And it doesn't say that, but it had to have been. The same type of heart that was scared in Joshua 5 and verse 1 is the same that we see of the people here in the book of Esther.
When you say melted heart, it's the opposite of a hardened heart.
Yeah.
Like you figure it out.
I think a melted heart, I didn't look up the word, but I think it's more focused upon like that scared, that sinking feeling that there's nothing you can do. And Rahab, she was wise in saying, you know what, I'm going to go on your side. I want to know who your God is. And then, of course, Rahab ended up in the lineage of Christ. And so you look at this here and all the things it's talked about. God's not mentioned, but we can see his protection. And so then verse 3, it says, and all the officials of the province, the satraps, the governors, and all doing the king's work helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. So not only do you have the Jews defending, what does it mean that they helped? What is the way that they could help? We're talking about the governors, the officials, everybody that had any connection to working for the king helped the Jews. How would they have helped them? Yeah, they probably would have taken up arms or done something to help protect them, give them a place to defend themselves. But I think it also means they took up swords and stood with them. And if someone had tried to attack them, they would fight alongside them. That's pretty impressive because, you're talking 120 different governors of 127 governors of different provinces. You have all of their officials. That's a lot of people who, because of what we see, because of the fear of Mordecai, they stood with the Jews. Now, as we've talked about, there's a comparison between Haman and Mordecai. Everything that we're seeing about Mordecai, Haman desired to have, right? What did Haman want? Ultimate power. He wanted respect from people. He wanted them to worship him. He wanted them to melt when he walked in front of them. He wanted them to be so scared of him that they would fall down and do whatever he said. And he demanded it from people, even to the point where he wanted Mordecai killed. Mordecai has pretty much all of that. Did he desire that? Did he demand that from people? How did he get it? Yeah. His character was completely opposite of Haman. He was out looking to, as we're going to see in chapter 10, he was out trying to do good. He was out trying to protect his people. He was out trying to be their advocate. Because of that, he received all the things that Haman was desiring to have and coveted. And so, verse 4, it says, "For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man named Mordecai became increasingly prominent." The King James Version uses the phrase, waxed greater and greater. The idea of that word is that it's just like day by day, his fame continued to grow, his respect from people continued to grow. And until we get to chapter 10, where it talks about how he is second in command, and pretty much, into this chapter, he puts into law this day of Purim, that they were going to celebrate this feast. He makes it a law. I mean, he has a lot of power and a lot of authority by this point. So, very interesting to see the development of Mordecai and what Haman wanted. Mordecai got everything Haman wanted, but there are different characteristics there. And so, verse 5 says, "Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. And in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed about 500 men." And so that seems to be a small number compared to how big the city is. But, we don't want it to be a huge number. But 500 is quite a few people. But as we're going to see, there's 75,000 total throughout the whole kingdom that ends up dying because of this. All right, somebody want to tackle the names? Let's read verse 7 through verse 17. There you go. If you want to, that's fine. Just skip over that. Verse 7 and 8, 9.
The 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, they killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. On that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan, the citadel, were brought to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan in the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done." Then Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows." That's interesting. Sounds like to me they were already dead.
They were.
Okay.
It's a good catch, but yes, they were dead.
How far am I supposed to read that?
Through 17.
So the king commanded this to be done. The decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. And the Jews who were in Shushan gathered together again on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and killed 300 men at Shushan. Hold on, that's the page. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. The remainder of the Jews in the king's province gathered together and protected their lives, had rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their enemies. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness.
All right, so the first thing we notice, including on top of the 500 men that were killed in the capital, verse 7, 8, and 9 tell us that the 10 sons of Haman also. So we see that their hatred for the Jews was just as much as with their father. Maybe they were out for vengeance. Maybe they thought, you know what, we're going to get back at Mordecai and the king, and we're going to try to kill as many as we could. It didn't work. And all 10 of his sons, what's that going to do to Haman's lineage? It's gone because of that. And so his name would not continue. And we see that happen a lot with kings that were wiped out, or things like that throughout the different kingdoms, they would try to kill all of their heirs so that they would not have any heirs to rise up and claim the throne anymore. And so his 10 sons, good catch, Kathy, was that they are killed here, and then later we're going to see they're hung. But they were killed, and notice again, this is the first time we see this. They did not lay a hand on the plunder. Why do you think they didn't? They were allowed to, right? The decree said you could. That any of those people they killed, they could take their plunder. Why did not the Jews do it? Or why did the Jews not do it?
But are they talking about Haman's plunder? Because, didn't Mordecai already own all of his stuff?
No, this is talking about all the 500 that died. It would have included those 10, sons. And yes, Esther now owns all of that. So they would not have had anything for sure. That's right. But it's talking about those 500.
God's people had to maintain their character.
Mm-hmm.
Mordecai was doing it, not Mordecai. Haman was doing it for greedy ambition. And so the Jews were just seeking safety.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they didn't. Yeah, from what we can tell, they were fairly well off. Good people, they were good for the economy there. Another thing I noticed is that it says men. Doesn't say women, doesn't say children. I think that they could have killed their, if the Persians had gone through with what they wanted and succeeded, they would have killed the whole family. But they didn't. Just the men that went after them. And so that plunder would have been left for their families. So is that kind of an act of mercy in a sense? I think so. Could be. It's just interesting, little details. But this is the first time we see that. It's going to be mentioned again. I think it's 3 times, or maybe just 2. 3 times, yep. And so on that day, the number of those who were killed was brought to the king. So there was a report brought to the king. And he says to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the citadel and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It should be granted to you, or what is your further request? It shall be done. So the king then comes to Esther and gives a report of what had happened. What is interesting about that movement by the king Ahasuerus? What has happened previously between those two in the interactions and the communication? Who goes to who? She always goes to him. Here, the king is eager to go to her and say, hey, this is what has happened. This is what's been done in the city. This is what's been reported to me. And then he even says, what else do you want? What does that say about him in his regards to her? Yeah, he really loved her, right? He wanted to make her happy. He wanted to see her being protected, safe, and happy. I think it's interesting because before, she always went to him in fear of losing her life. But he comes to her here. And we see that he asks that question, what do you want? It will be granted to you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done. Whatever you think needs to happen now, I'll authorize it. And so what does she say? Verse 13. If it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do it again tomorrow according to the day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. So 2 requests. One is that they have another day of this. Why? Why do you think she would want another day of this? What happened to the Israelites when they went into the promised land and didn't wipe out those that were enemies of God? They kept coming back and become a problem, right? By doing this a second day, remember, they're not on the offense here. They're not going out looking for people to kill. They're protecting themselves. They're on the defense. So she is asking again for another day of defense, to be able to protect themselves, to stamp out any future hatred towards them again. And then she says, then let his sons be hanged on the gallows. They're already dead, as Kathy stated. What would be the purpose of hanging them on the gallows?
Well, the gallows you described were not
Yeah, if it's it's not what we think is the westerns with the gallows and hanging on a rope. This was impaled upon a pole. That's how they did it in the Persian Empire. So why would they impale them on a pole that are already dead? As an example of this is what will happen if you try to go against us. And really, not just the Jews, but against the king. Because remember, all of his people that work for him are protecting the Jews also. So, it's going to squash any future revolt or any future vengeance, hatred towards the Jews. And it's going to protect God's people. And so that's their two requests. And so what is done? Notice verse 14. So the king commanded this to be done. The decree was issued, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons on those poles. And so it happened just like she were asked. And so the Jews who were in Shushan gathered together again on the 14th day of the month, killed 300 men of Shushan, and did not lay a hand on the plunder. Again, another day. You'd think that the people would have learned from the day before, you're not going to prevail. 300 men try again, and it doesn't work. And then again, they did not lay hand on their plunder. So then verse 16, the remainder of the Jews in the king provinces gathered together and protected their lives and the rest from their enemies and killed 75,000 of their enemies. That's a lot. Now remember, 127 provinces spread out from a huge, massive area. Medo-Persia had probably the biggest empire. I think they had the biggest empire to date in the world. And 75,000 people died. Now, if you look at Septuagint, it says 15,000. Why there's a different number there, I don't know. But it's interesting. Some commentators bring that up, that the Septuagint will say 15,000 there. I don't think that's accurate because all the other transcripts will say 75,000 there. But we see something we kind of side note we notice from this. 75,000 people died throughout 127 provinces. What does that say about where the Jews lived? All 127 provinces. That was, I don't think we've talked about this, but that was one of the things. I think it started with Assyria. So if you remember, Assyria was one of the first empires. They were the first ones to oppress Israel, the northern tribes, before Babylon, before Medo-Persia. It was Assyria, and one of Assyria's practices was to take the people of the land they would conquer, and they would take them and move them, transplant them in a new place. And that was practiced by many other powers to be afterwards. So Babylon would do the same thing. They'd go into Israel, they would take all the people captive, and they would move them to India, or they would move them to different parts of the kingdom. And that's where we see some of the prophets that wrote during the time of the exile for Medo-Persia and Babylon. You had Jeremiah, who was a prophet that wrote in the land of Israel. I think Ezekiel was, where was Daniel during that time? He wrote in the capital with Babylon, in Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. And Ezekiel was by a river. I can't remember exactly where it was at. But so you can see the prophets were spread out through the nations. And so we see the Jews spread out throughout the whole world. Now, as we get to the New Testament and Paul is on his missionary journeys, what does he find? Almost every city he goes to. Jews and a synagogue, right? Synagogues came out of this time period. We don't see any authorization for synagogues in the Old Testament. But when you get to Malachi, and then you open up your Bibles and read the book of Matthew, you read about synagogues. Those synagogues came from this period of time, from the Jews being spread out through these 127 different provinces throughout the world. So just a neat detail to think about here, and what we see where the Jews are at. And so, verse 17, it says, "This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness." Now, verse 18 and following is going to be a decree then made, a law made by Mordecai of this celebration that we just read here. This celebration was their day after their victory. This celebration is going to be known as Purim. Now, the feast of Purim is not authorized, it's not been, it was not one of God's laws that he had. This was brought about by Mordecai, but it's still celebrated in the New Testament, and it's celebrated by people still today. But we'll talk about that as we get to the end of chapter 10. And so, any questions on anything from this point? All right, well, let's read. We're about out of time. Let's read a few more verses here. Let's read verse 18. It says, "But the Jews who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day, as well as on the 14th, and on the 15th day of the month they rested and made a day of feasting and gladness." So just to repeat what we saw in verse 17. Then verse 19, "Therefore the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another." Now this is going to become part of the law, is that you would celebrate and then exchange gifts to one another. And I couldn't find any significance in the presenting of gifts, why that was done. Nobody really had any added information on that idea there. I think that's just an interesting detail, and it's included in Mordecai's law that comes later, that they would do this, to give one each other gifts, to celebrate that way. And so then verse 20 says, "Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far who were in all provinces of King Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the days of which the Jews had rested from their enemies, as the month which would turn from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday. They should make them days of feasting of joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast pur, that is lot, to consume them and to destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that the wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows." And so just a repeat of what we already know, but this decree was sent out by Mordecai for the people to establish this day every year, these 2 days, every year, to celebrate and remember this, what had happened here in God's protection, really. We're out of time. There's some more I want to talk about there, but we'll pick up later. But any questions on anything or comments? We're about done with the book of Esther. And I think Caleb's going to pick up teaching. I don't know what he's going to teach yet, but teaching on Wednesday nights. But before that, we'll have next week. We'll be done. But I plan on doing a review. So be ready. Nobody's going to show up next week now.